Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Kulluna Irada's policy discussions. The theme of the session today is the Lebanese-Israeli ceasefire agreement. We're going to be looking at its implications on Lebanon, analyzing the wider regional context, and at a later stage during the discussion, also talking a little bit about what projections for the next upcoming U.S. administration's move and outlook and policies for the region. With us today are Randa and Gregg Carlstrom. Randa and Gregg, thank you very much for joining us today. So Randa is the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies, Foreign Policy Institute. She's a former vice president of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, and she has also been a senior program advisor at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a guest scholar at the United States Institute of Peace, program director at Resolve, Inc., and a program officer at the Kettering Foundation. She's the author of several studies, book chapters, and articles on conflict management, post-conflict peace building, and Middle East politics. Randa, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Also is Gregg Carlstrom. Gregg is a Middle East correspondent for The Economist, based in Dubai. He has covered the region for more than a decade, with stints in Cairo, Beirut, and Tel Aviv. His reporting and analysis on the Middle East has been published in a number of other publications, including Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, and Politico. His first book, How Long Will Israel Survive? The Threat from Within, was published in 2017. Hi, Gregg, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll start the discussion, with the latest developments over the last couple of days. It's very tempting to start with Syria, but we'll start with Lebanon and the breaches to the ceasefire agreement. So maybe we'll start with you, Randa, and just can you give us an overview of this agreement? What do you think of it? Do you think it will hold? And how do you read the recent breaches of the agreement from both the Israeli side, but also from Hezbollah's end?
Good to be with you. Good to be with Gregg, and looking forward to this discussion. So, quick answer to your question. I'm going to quote, in fact, a colleague of mine, many of you know, Aaron David Miller. Aaron and I appeared on a national TV show last Tuesday, in fact, a week ago, to discuss the agreement. And Aaron used the sentence, which I really liked, and I think it explains a lot about the prospects for this deal to survive or not. And he says, the deal happened because Israel wants it and Hezbollah needs it. And I think it's exactly what drove this deal. And it is exactly the factors or the drivers that will keep this deal in place, despite the violations that we have been seeing since the deal came into effect on the part of Israel mostly, and in the last 2 days or last day on the part of Hezbollah in response to the Israeli violation. So Israel wanted it for a number of reasons. And it's basically exactly the same what happened in 2006. In 2006, we had a deal, and eventually UNSCR 1701 agreed to, because at the time, Prime Minister Olmert went to the Americans and says, I want this over, I want a deal. And again, this time, it was Netanyahu going to the Americans after months of negotiation, saying, I want the deal, I want it to happen. Now, what drove it is Netanyahu, in his speech explaining the deal to Israel, he mentioned three factors. I think the most important factor of the three is exhaustion, is that he needed his army to regroup, he needed his army to, he needed provisions, he needed more weapons from the United States going forward. So that's one. I think that's very important. And the second factor that he mentioned, although Hezbollah had already gone that way, which is separating the Gaza war from the Lebanon-Israel front. And Hezbollah had already agreed on that, before that speech and before the deal, during, I think, one of the speeches of Naim Qassem, in which he indirectly said, we have done our part on Gaza, and basically I'm I'm putting words in his mouth, but the message from it is that we have done our part on Gaza, and now it's a time to focus on the Lebanon. And this continues. I think Netanyahu will keep the deal in place, will violate it, of course. Will continue, because as he put it yesterday or today, he said, there is a ceasefire, but the war is not over. So this is how they are looking at it in terms of continuing forward. And then they have to explain, and then they will come up with every reason you can think of to talk about any movement by Hezbollah in south of Italy as a violation. I mean, Israel will be doing that more and more and more, and trying to explain why it is a violation and why they need to respond. So I think we expect more violation, but still, as far as Israel, it's not going to undermine, at least for as long as Netanyahu needs it, it's not going to undermine their desire or their want for the deal. On Hezbollah, they need it. I mean, the devastating blows to Hezbollah's internal operations, to Hezbollah command structure, to Hezbollah, weapons caches, to the Hezbollah constituency, the devastation that we are now seeing more and more in many of these Shia majority areas. I think, he needs it. He needs it to regroup. He needs to take care of the infiltration of its ranks by Israel. He needs it to figure out his command structure. He needs it to help his constituents build and, heal. So that's the equation. As long as these two sides, one wants it, the other needs it, I expect this to hold.
Okay. So you believe that violations will continue, but the deal will hold because both sides, to a certain extent, need it at the moment.
When this changes, when one of the sides, basically that drive, wants it on the Israeli side, needs it on the Hezbollah side, when one of these factors changes, then I think the deal might not hold.
Okay, thanks, Randa. Gregg, what is your reading of the deal, of the violations? There's also a sense that there's a lot of ambiguity, right, around this agreement, and there's a lot of talk around the real gist of the agreement being in the parallel deal between the US and Israel. How do you read everything that is developing? Are the Israeli violations today violations to the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire agreement, but are they really in the agreement with the US? Is the US okay with these violations, do you believe? Or no, is it really the Israelis trespassing there? And how do you read also Hezbollah's latest violations of the agreement?
I think for the Israeli side, there's going to be a tremendous amount of room for maneuver, at least in this initial 60-day period in the beginning of the ceasefire. They don't have to withdraw their troops first, so that obviously gives them the ability to impose the sorts of restrictions we've seen in the south of Lebanon, where they're preventing people from going back to their villages near the border. On top of that, on top of keeping their troops in South Lebanon, they also have this lame duck presidential administration that they have clearly shown no respect for over the course of the year. And so even if Israel does something that Joe Biden or Joe Biden's advisors might find to be going too far, to be outside the bounds of what was meant to be in this side agreement, I don't think Netanyahu is going to place much stock in what Biden thinks. But that being said, I think also in this initial period, I mean, what Randa said is exactly right. The Israelis have incentives or interests to abide by this deal, at least for now. The pressure on their military is real. It's overstretched after the past year. There's some official data from the Israeli military that came out in the past couple of weeks that finds the reservists who've been called up over the past year, more than half of those reservists have been called up for a period of more than 100 days, and about 1/3 of them have been called up for more than 150 days. So you have people who have been in military service and in reserve service for 3, 4, 5, 6 months over the past year. That has put a real strain on the military to the point where you have units where people aren't showing up for reserve service in Israel. And this is something that the army brass, the generals, have been begging the political class for the past couple of months to try to bring an end to at least one of these wars, to take some of the pressure off of the military. And so that is a very real factor in why Israel agreed to the ceasefire. And that incentive to abide by the ceasefire remains in place for a while. They need to give the military some time to rest and regroup. There's also, I think, going to be a desire not to get on the bad side of the incoming presidential administration. I mean, Trump was clear that he wanted the war in Lebanon to end, if only because he now has a Lebanese son-in-law, but that makes a difference. And so I think Netanyahu is not going to want to do something in the next 2 months that, having ended this war, suddenly puts the war back in Donald Trump's inbox when he comes in January. I think the concern with the ceasefire is a bit further down the road. It's, in 6 months' time, when some of the pressure on the Israeli military has lifted, when units have had a chance to rest and refit, and there are some people in the military who perhaps then start arguing, well, look, there are ongoing violations in Lebanon, Hezbollah is trying to rearm or whatever, and there might be another push to resume the conflict at that point. And then I think the last concern is just, we can talk about incentives and interests and motivations, and that's all correct, but things happen sometimes that nobody wants to happen. If you think back to the beginning of the summer, the discourse in Israel was very much that, okay, there's a policy debate going on. There are some Israeli officials who are pushing for a war in Lebanon. There are some Israeli officials who don't want a war in Lebanon. And Netanyahu was one of those officials who didn't want a war. The thing that changed that was that Hezbollah rocket that landed in the Golan Heights that killed children on a football pitch in the Golan Heights. That's what shifted the policy debate in Israel in favor of the war that we then saw in Lebanon. So even though neither side, you can say, has an interest right now in resuming a conflict, I think there is a risk that these violations that we've already seen, that they keep building up, and something that neither side wants could end up happening, as it did just a few months ago.
Thank you, Gregg. Randa, you mentioned earlier that Hezbollah also needed this deal, but there are a lot of question marks today on the extent to which Hezbollah is going to commit to the disarmament process that is in this deal. And there is a sense that they might try to gain some time, to try to maybe with time evade this disarmament. Do you think this is possible? Do you see Hezbollah committing? What are the options in the near future regarding the disarmament? Do you believe it will be limited to south of the Litani, or will it be over all of Lebanon, as stipulated in the agreement?
I think, as you put it in the last part of your comments and question, I think right now Hezbollah will commit to withdrawal, if we can put it, of its weapons south of the Litani, that section between the Litani and the border. I mean, there is now a much stronger enforcement mechanisms with resources to it, with resources allocated to it, and a political will. Remember, there was such a mechanisms under UNSCR 1701, but the UNIFIL was constantly threatened, in terms of force security, and so they tried to basically turn a blind eye to these violations, especially on the Hezbollah side, but there was also violation on the Israeli side. So right now you have a stronger implementation mechanisms, this committee that is going to be co-headed by 2 American, 1 civilian, and 1 military. And they will have the resources to be able to monitor all of this on the ground. It's still not clear to me how much they will be able to enforce on the Israeli side, right? I mean, in any deal, when there are violations, there should be consequences to deter further violations. I'm not sure what are the consequences for the Israeli side to these violations past 60 days, and past withdrawal, because they will continue to do that. So I think disarmament, I understand this linkage and the precedent set in the agreement 1559, and I don't see Hezbollah today, given the geopolitical situation, given the domestic situation, willing to disarm, period. And there will be no disarming of Hezbollah until Hezbollah decides to disarm. It's just as simple as that, unless we are thinking of 170,000 US soldiers coming into Lebanon and basically forcing that. And even with that, I'm not sure that can happen. So we are going to see, weapons being moved out of that area south of the Litani, but they're going to be moved back into the rest of Lebanon. And so the question is going to be, what are the domestic dynamics about the future of Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is going to undertake a major re-evaluation. They done that. By the way, in 1992, they were the only party who engaged in a year-long intensive reflection and study of the implication of the Taif agreement. And they came up with what are the consequences, what does it mean for them domestically and regionally. And in fact, if you look at their policies and their positioning since 1992 till, now, recently, it's very much in line with the conclusions they came up with based on the review of what Taif means for them domestically and regionally. I think they will be undertaking a similar study and a similar assessment, and they're going to come up with their own conclusion, which will determine their policies for the next few years. But at this point, I think it's going to be mostly domestic dynamics, guiding these policies. And in the presence of the Trump administration, depending on where they go, I think Iran will have a major say in the disarmament of Hezbollah. It's one of the few files, in fact, that Iran has a major say over with Hezbollah. There are not many files that Iran does get involved with in terms of Hezbollah decision-making. One of them is peace and war with Israel, and any kind of issues dealing with their weapons and any kind of issues dealing with the United States. These are files that, the supreme leader himself gets involved and basically decide in consultation in the past with Nasrallah, and now we don't know how it's going to go forward. So a long-winded answer to your question, I don't think we are going to see Hezbollah disarm in the short to medium term because of geopolitical conditions, because of domestic dynamics. And the question is, how is Hezbollah going to reposition inside Lebanon? I think it's going to be very interesting. I don't know. I mean, I've been hearing of an ongoing debate inside Hezbollah of starting to help move the political process toward this one-third formula, eventually, as a way of basically, winning the political game when they have lost the military game. But we'll see. But that's going to be that's an ongoing debate, and I don't know how the opposition, which is very divided and fragmented, will deal with that. But it's a very critical moment.
Yeah, we'll get back to that later, because I'm interested in hearing your views regarding the trade-offs, if any, that Hezbollah is willing to make internally, particularly with regards to the political system and changes in the political system. Gregg, I saw you nodding at some point when Randa was saying that she does not expect Hezbollah to disarm. You're nodding in agreement. Do you believe this will be the scenario? Do you believe the most realistic scenario will be some kind of a temporary withdrawal behind the Litani for now, and that eventually with time Hezbollah is going to regroup and basically regain positions?
And I think, first with the caveat that it's probably very hard to say what they are planning to do either in the short term or the long term because of what has happened to their leadership over the past few months. It's not even clear who is going to be making those decisions for the long term, and there is going to be, as Randa says, this process of trying to assess what went wrong and chart a new course. But no, I mean, do I think that right now there's going to be any desire on the part of the party, not just looking at dynamics inside of Lebanon, but looking at dynamics in Syria, looking at dynamics across the region? Are they going to look at what's going on right now and decide that this is a moment to relinquish their weapons entirely? I don't think that's a choice they're going to make. I think in the short term, there are things that they can do to sort of make a show of removing some weapons from south of the Litani to satisfy this international committee that is going to be monitoring the ceasefire, to try and satisfy public opinion, perhaps in Lebanon to some extent, from people who are critical of Hezbollah for bringing the country into this conflict over the past year. But that is a far cry from actually disarming, actually agreeing to put its weapons, I think, under the control of the Lebanese state.
Thanks, Gregg. Randa, do you believe that this committee that was formed sort of to monitor the implementation of the agreement will be okay with what you and Gregg just described, some sort of a temporary withdrawal of Hezbollah? Will that be okay for the committee, or do you feel that politically there is more of a political will, particularly on behalf of the US, but also Israel and others, to see Hezbollah really disarmed this time?
I mean, the agreement is about withdrawal of Hezbollah forces from the stretch of territory, right, between the Litani and the Blue Line, and dismantle any infrastructure there for Hezbollah, and dismantle any production facilities for Hezbollah in that area. But also there is this caveat, or, you know, any production facilities for Hezbollah, period. I think the committee is going to be focusing on implementing the agreement in terms of this stretch of the area between the Litani and the Blue Line. That's going to be its priority. I think anything beyond that is going to be, Israel might have, I mean, it has freedom of action to go after weapons production facilities north of the Litani River. It will maintain that freedom of action, as they have been doing in Syria, you know? So it's the same scenario that's going to be repeating itself. And I wonder whether the committee will look at it as a breach or violation of the agreement that has to do with this buffer zone, you know, between the Litani. It will be interesting to see. The other point I want to bring up is we're going to have a new administration that's going to have different priorities. The focus is going to be on China, on the illegal immigration. I don't know who's going to man the civilian side on the committee, on the American side, once the new administration comes in. Hochstein is leaving the administration, of course, and going into the private sector. So I wonder whether, I mean, who's going to come into that role, and will that person, and then how much the president, Trump, will pay attention to this. I mean, I don't think he will pay much attention, you know. Maybe his Lebanese-born advisor will, you know, bring up the subject to him every now and then. But he has so many Middle East advisors that I don't know how the decision on the Middle East are going to be made with this administration going forward. And so and this agreement, this committee to continue to work will need a lot of commitment from the US, right? I mean, they are playing the heavy role here. And I don't know how much the incoming, again, I'm repeating myself, the incoming administration will commit to the committee in terms of resources, in terms of time, in terms of presidential attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Gregg, what do you think, what do you think Netanyahu is preparing for following the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon? Do you believe that he wants to turn his attention to the front with Iran? Do you believe that this will happen? Does he plan on doing it? Is he waiting maybe for the new administration? What are your thoughts on this?
I think what Netanyahu is preparing for personally is the same thing that Netanyahu has spent many, many years preparing for, which is trying to save Benjamin Netanyahu, trying to save his political career. I think if he's focused on anything right now, he's focused on the fact that in about a week's time, he's meant to appear in court to testify in his corruption trial. He's focused on these threats from some of the far-right members of his coalition to leave the coalition if they're not allowed to continue the war in Gaza and pursue a settlement project in Gaza. I think that is what preoccupies him. And so I think, you know, despite the sort of lofty language that he used about in announcing the ceasefire about how we need to end the Lebanon war to focus on Iran, I think a large part of the calculus for him was Trump is coming into power. Trump wants me to wrap up one of these wars in the Middle East. Trump wants less conflict in the region. I can end the war in Lebanon without upsetting my coalition partners. Yes, there was some criticism, but no one threatened to leave the Israeli government and bring down the government over a ceasefire in Lebanon. The incentives look very different in Gaza. His coalition partners have said quite clearly, we will blow up your government if you end the Gaza war. And so he's thinking he can trade one war for another. Now, he has always wanted to enlist American help to strike at Iran's nuclear facilities, or not even American help. He wants America to do the job for him. And that is why, despite 15 years of Benjamin Netanyahu saying that we need to hit Iran and we're about to do it and we're close to do it and we're preparing to do it, Israel has never actually done it. He would really like the Americans to do it for him, and he really would like that now because the Iranian nuclear program has gotten to a point where Israel just cannot do that much damage acting on its own. So do I think he will, in his discussions with Trump and the people around Trump in the coming months, try to lobby them to carry out some sort of American military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities? I think he will do that. I don't know how far he's going to get with Trump, but I think, and it's ironic because Netanyahu made so much of his political career out of this focus on Iran. There was a moment about 10 years ago where the state comptroller in Israel prepared a report on the high cost of living and the fact that the government wasn't doing enough to bring down the cost of living for Israelis. And Netanyahu, in his comments addressing this report when it was released, he said, the cost of living is important, but I want to focus on something that threatens life itself, and that is Iran. Everything came back to Iran with him. Now we're at a point where Iran's nuclear program actually has reached the sort of threshold of being able to make a bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium. Netanyahu's priorities are elsewhere. Netanyahu's priorities are on whatever he has to do to keep Donald Trump happy, to keep his coalition partners happy, to keep himself in power, and hopefully keep himself out of prison.
Thanks, Gregg. Randa, what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe? And also, what do you think about Trump himself? Do you think Trump would want to sort of adopt a more hardliner attitude towards the Iranians? Would maybe a Netanyahu and Trump duo want to actually attack Iran, or do you think that's far-fetched?
I want to make 2 points about that. One point is how this administration will differ from the previous administration in terms of personnel. And, as you well know, personnel makes policies, right? Or policy is personnel. And unlike Trump 1.0, he had like 3 categories of people, right, around him. And one of the categories was the neocons, the Bolton of the world. And those were the ones, and then you had also another category of traditional conservatives, Mattis, Tillerson, and then you had only a smaller circle of the MAGA people, but they were totally sidelined by these other 2 groups during Trump 1.0. If you look at this administration or the appointments until now, it's very clear that there will be no neocons, if we can put it this way. And those were the ones who were driving mostly the Iran policy. When Trump was trying to make a deal with Iran, right, it was the Bolton of the world who, stood in his way, because despite all his skills at negotiating a deal, the president cannot make a deal. Maybe Obama had the intellectual power or the intellectual skills to be able to guide the negotiations over deal making in 2015, 2014 with Iran. Trump does not have the attention span and does not have the intellectual powers to be able to structure a deal together with Iran. So he will basically look at Bolton, who was his national security advisor, even when he wanted to make a deal, go and make a deal or put a deal for us together. And of course, Bolton and the others in that crowd will do everything they can to basically block that. And they succeeded. So if we look at that, so what he has now is people like Rubio, who are very much anti, any agreement with Iran. But at the same time, what we have is that you have a critical mass of MAGA people in different agencies that eventually is going to be Trump call. And Trump on Iran has had a very interesting approach, even in the past. On one hand, he believes that he wants a deal. He wanted a deal with Iran then. He could not get it, again, because of the factors, and partly because also of Iranian internal politics. So he wants a deal. He said it during the campaign. I want to make a beautiful deal with Iran. But at the same time, he believes that the way to get to a deal is through strength, in the past, it was maximum pressure. Now it is enforcing sanctions that are on the book vis-a-vis oil sales of, Iranian oil sales, which the Biden administration turned a blind eye to. So we are going to get, at least in the first year or two, of Trump really, turning the temperature up in terms of sanctions and on Iran, but at the same time sending messages to Iran via, maybe the French. It seems his relationship with Macron is pretty good, that he wants a deal. And he was able to do that. If you take Afghanistan, the military military institution, the intelligence, the intelligence institutions were all against a deal with Taliban. Trump said, I want a deal with Taliban. He found somebody like, Zalmay Khalilzada, and he got a deal with the Taliban. I think right now is the first year or two will be pressure, because he believes that's a better way to get a deal, or a better deal with Iran, that you weaken your opponent. That's his approach to negotiations. And then I think he's going to find somebody in his administration who will basically be tasked to make a deal with Iran.
And the pressure you see will mainly be economic, right? So you mainly see sanctions.
I see mostly economics. I totally agree with Gregg. I don't see him. Another motto of him is that during his first term, there were no wars, except we were engaged in a war in Afghanistan. And his people will say to you, when you argue with them, they will reply, oh, but he did not initiate any war. I don't think he will go for the Israeli lobbying, by Netanyahu and others in the Israeli cabinet for a military approach to to tackle Iran. And I think he's going to be mostly economics, sanctions, and I think that's how that's my bet. I don't think he will go for military. It goes against, a principal motto in his campaign, peace. I want peace, but then he says peace through strength, but it does not mean through war.
Thank you, Randa. Gregg, what do you think the incoming administration wants from the region, for the region? What would Trump want to see in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria also, and the wider region?
I think in his first term, Trump didn't have a Middle East policy so much as he had a series of impulses about the Middle East. Be supportive of Israel was one of them, and not just of Israel, but of right-wing Israeli policy priorities. Hostility towards Iran was another one of them. But what did he want to achieve? What were these impulses meant to achieve? And what Randa was saying about these personnel divisions in his first administration, was maximum pressure meant to reach a new nuclear deal? Was it meant to reach some kind of bigger grand bargain that would have seen Iran curtail its support for proxies across the region, or rein in its missile program? Was maximum pressure meant to overthrow the regime? Was it just a backdoor way to do regime change in Iran? Trump himself wasn't really clear what it was meant to do, and the people around him had very different views about that. And so this impulse of putting pressure on Iran didn't really lead to much, because it wasn't clear what that policy was supposed to lead to. And I think at this point, looking at the people that Trump has selected, you think about his Middle East advisors. Jared Kushner is going to play this unofficial role where his priority will be on trying to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, trying to broker this normalization deal that he's very happy the Biden administration didn't do, because he wants to be the guy who gets to take credit for it. You have Steve Witkoff, the official Middle East advisor. We don't really know what he thinks about anything, but I suspect he will be aligned with Netanyahu and aligned with the sort of Kushner wing of pushing for normalization deals. Massad Boulos, what he wants to do as the president's Middle East advisor, we're not clear. You look at his track record in Lebanese politics, and he's been involved with various factions over the years. Just about every Christian party in Lebanon at one point or another, he's dabbled with. What his views actually are on both Lebanese politics and America's role in the region is not clear. I think when it comes to Gaza, Trump hasn't said much about Gaza, aside from that statement that he put out last night regarding the hostages, the hostages who are still being held in Gaza. But aside from that, he hasn't shown an interest really in trying to end that conflict. And I think if the Netanyahu government comes to him and says, we need to continue this, I'm not sure I see Trump putting a whole lot of pressure on Netanyahu around Gaza, as long as that conflict seems to be sort of isolated and manageable, and it's not triggering the sort of bigger regional tensions that we saw over the past year. I'm not sure Trump is going to put a whole lot of pressure there. But, I think all of this, there was a running joke in Trump's first administration where every month or two, the White House would say, this is going to be infrastructure week, and the president is going to be laser focused on unveiling proposals to make American infrastructure better. And then inevitably on Monday morning, Trump would tweet something insane about dropping nuclear bombs into hurricanes to steer them off course, or buying Greenland, or all of these crazy things that he proposed. And everybody would forget about infrastructure. And then 2 months later, we'd try again to do infrastructure week, and it became a joke. And I think when it comes to anything, but certainly when it comes to the Middle East, is the president going to have sustained attention on this? As Randa said, it's not his priority. It's not his administration's top priority. And so I think whatever impulses this administration might have, the policy is liable to just end up drifting and being buffeted along by events, rather than being driven by a very clear idea of where they want to go.
Can I add something to what Gregg said?
Please.
I think he's coming into this knowing that he's not doesn't have a chance at presidency again. I'm assuming, I don't know, maybe he will start thinking he might change the constitution in 2 years' time, but we don't know. But he's coming into this understanding he will not. And I think he really wants to make some deal that he will be known for. And I think he has two areas where a deal will will give a legacy. One is North Korea, right? And the other is Iran. And I would say the third is Saudi Arabia, Israel normalization. These are the three areas where deal making is possible for him to ensure an enduring legacy in foreign policy, and to his name and to his brand. And so I agree with Gregg. Kushner will be given that portfolio of pushing forward the Saudi-Israeli normalization. I think, how much the Saudis will go for, given the recent language about genocide taking place. I don't know how you can walk back genocide to a deal again, but I can see that possible. It could be, but I think it's going to be very difficult. I think North Korea is possible, but also it will be, difficult given all the regional dynamics there. I think Iran is very much a deal that Trump will be interested in, partly because he wants to remove any trace of Obama 2015 deal. He wants to be the one. He reneged it, but he wants to be the one who will say this is a Trump deal. And so he will be focusing on that. But again, a deal like this requires presidential attention, presidential diplomatic heft. Building on what Gregg said, we are going to have Rubio, at state. He has already 2 advisors on the Middle East who will be speaking with him. And we know Trump will go with the last person, whoever the last person spoke with him. There will be the Secretary of Defense. We don't know. There will be the CIA person, But the number of advisors already in the White House, the National Security Advisor, who are going to be competing all for to make their mark on the Middle East is going to be really pretty large. And you don't have a president who is, as Gregg said, who has his own thinking about what does he want to accomplish, which will keep changing every now and then. But I can see, people around him, making or I can see him coming into with this idea that an Iran deal is one way for me to have this legacy. But also I can see potential of his advisors, if they want to kill the deal, to basically also get his attention to kill the deal or prevent it or delay it.
Thank you, Randa. Before moving to the Q&A session, I'd like to move a bit to what's happening in Syria. It's too big. There are lots of question marks on the developments. Gregg, could you walk us a bit through the landscape, what is happening over there? And maybe then, Randa, you could also give us your point of view.
So what is happening, I mean, just about a week ago, we had lines in Syria that had been more or less frozen since 2020, right? The front lines really hadn't moved for almost 5 years. And what's happened over the past week is Aleppo has fallen to rebels, both Tahrir Sham and the Syrian National Army, which is essentially a Turkish proxy force in northern Syria, despite its very lofty sounding name. They have consolidated control. They are consolidating control over Aleppo. They are pushing the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish, mostly Kurdish militia in the northeast, American-backed militia, pushing them to the east. And then the rebels have swept down to the northern outskirts of Hama, about 100 kilometers or so south of Aleppo. So stunning rout for the Assad regime, which around Aleppo, its troops essentially just turned and fled. They've organized a defense around Hama, it seems, and they've been able to consolidate their lines around there. And so that has become the new front line. And why now? I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I think the timing, certainly given the ceasefire in Lebanon, was not coincidental. The ceasefire in Lebanon happened, and then almost immediately after that, this rebel offensive began. But not just about Lebanon, not just about the fact that Hezbollah, which has been the Assad regime's main supporter or earliest supporter, let's say, since the onset of the Syrian civil war, not just the fact that they have been weakened by a year of war with Israel, but also many other developments in geopolitics. The Russians have drawn down some of their forces in Syria over the past couple of years because they've had obviously a need to send them to Ukraine. And so they've withdrawn between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian troops from Syria. Their air wing based in Syria is smaller than it was a few years ago. Iran obviously has seen its own positions being pummeled in Syria by Israel over the past year. And then the role of Turkey is obviously very significant in this. And I think the Turks are exasperated with Assad and with his Russian backers because they would like to normalize relations, to reconcile with the regime in the hope of sending back large numbers of Syrian refugees who are in Turkey. This is a very big domestic political issue for Erdogan. And Assad, as Assad does, has refused to make any concessions towards the Turks to enable that reconciliation. And so I think at this point, Turkey, not just frustrated with him, but also feels a bit like it has the upper hand with regards to Russia in their bilateral relationship because of the role that it's been playing over the past few years, hosting wealthy Russian citizens and wealthy Russian businesses who have fled since Russia invaded Ukraine, playing a role as mediator between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey almost feels like the senior partner in some ways in this relationship now and thinks that this might be a moment to press its advantage in Syria in a way that it hopes will give it more leverage over the regime.
Thank you. Randa, the Iranians just stated today that they're considering sending forces to support, that they would consider sending forces to support the Assad regime if he requests so. Do you believe that the Iranians will be more involved in supporting the Assad regime in this phase, or do they see this as sunk cost?
I mean, look, they're going to try to help keep this regime in place at any cost. The question is who they will be sending. I don't think Hezbollah is eager to go, given Assad's stance vis-a-vis Hezbollah in the last month, while they were being pummeled by Israel. I mean, trying to stay out of the fight, trying to stay neutral. And the Iraqi government, especially the Iraqi prime minister, is in a tough position here vis-a-vis the Americans, vis-a-vis the internal Iraqi militias. We have seen him today in his conversation with Turkey, increasing a little bit not threatening, but basically saying Iraq cannot stay, neutral vis-a-vis the dangerous developments in Syria. And so, but I don't know if he's in a position as Iraqi armed forces to lend help to the Syrian regime, but at least maybe turn a blind eye to militias, Iraqi militias crossing the border. And there have been,
which is what is happening.
We have seen video circulating. How much of that is happening? How big the contingent that is leaving? I don't know. I don't have eyes on the ground about that. So we will know eventually. Look, I agree with Gregg. Turkey is stronger in this triad. I mean, eventually the conflict will come to an end, or this current phase of the fighting will come to an end. It is going to be through negotiations between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Of the three, definitely Turkey has a stronger hand right now, but Russia maintains a very strong hand. Why? Because because it can threaten two Turkish national security interests, Russia. If Russia were to bomb the IDP camps in Idlib and cause a major refugee outflow or move toward Turkey, that's going to be a major threat to Turkey national security interests. And so far, you have seen Russia not targeting in its bombing of Idlib these refugee camps. They are targeting, center towns and stuff like that, but not the refugee camps. So that's one, but that's a threat that's hanging over. I mean, that's now primary for the Turkish decision makers. How Russia can, I mean, if Russia were to do that, what are the implications? And the second is the YPG, because that's the second national security interest for Turkey, is if this current phase of fighting creates more room for the YPG, to expand their role, to strengthen their role. I can see the Arab tribes held by the American carving a foothold eastern of the Euphrates yesterday or today. So, but the YPG is the second major concern for Turkey. So you are going to see movements back and forth. We have now hearing reports of potential rift starting to emerge between the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and the SNA, the Syrian National Army. It could be part of Turkey's move to basically decelerate the momentum of this offensive. Because I think, based on my conversations with people in Ankara, is that they don't think that moving toward Hama is a good move for this offensive. That maybe getting to Aleppo is okay, but moving toward Hama and starting to move maybe toward Homs later, that will bring, that will violate a major red line for Russia. So this is an evolving situation, and everybody will play their card. Eventually, it will be decided by a renegotiations of the front line. As Gregg said, the front lines have been frozen since 2020 due to an agreement between the Russians and the Turks. I think there will be a renegotiations of those front lines going forward.
Thank you, Randa. And we've seen today, of course, that the Syrian regime has done a big push in trying to protect Hama in order to prevent the rebel forces from arriving to Homs today. And until the moment, they have succeeded, at least from what we are reading, in keeping the rebels from entering Hama and getting to Homs. Gregg, what do the Americans and the Israelis want out of this dynamic that is unfolding in Syria?
I mean, I'm not sure they know the answer to that at the moment. Listen, I think the Israeli view, if you go back to the real years of the Syrian uprising a decade ago, the Israelis were very pro-regime, right? They viewed the Assad regime as the devil they knew in Syria. They had someone they could do business with in Damascus. They had a regime that had kept that border very, very quiet for decades. You sit with Israeli generals who would say, of the 4 borders that Israel has with Arab states, it was the Syrian border, despite the explicit state of war between the two countries, the Syrian border that was their quietest border since the end of the 1973 war. So they were in favor of the regime staying in power. I think the Israeli view of Assad is a bit more complicated than that now, because over the past year, you have had some people in the Israeli security establishment, not a majority of people, but some people who have begun to argue, listen, Bashar is too weak to control the country. He has become essentially nothing more than an empty shell through which Iran is able to expand its influence in Syria, send weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon, threaten our interests, Israel's interests in the south of Syria on the border with the Golan. And so there have been some Israeli security officials who have been arguing that Israel should change its position on Syria. And there's a couple of people who have suggested over the past year that Israel should just drop a bomb on the presidential palace in Damascus. That is, again, that's not a majority view, but people are not quite as pro-Bashar in Israel as they were a decade ago, because they think that he has allowed Iran to expand its influence so much in the country, and he is too weak to do anything about that. And you saw that over the past few months. There's been a lot of talk about, for example, the US lifting sanctions on Syria. There was a Reuters report just yesterday about the UAE lobbying the Americans to lift sanctions on Syria in exchange for the Assad regime breaking away from Iran, distancing itself from Iran, whatever that means in practice. And there are some Israelis who argue that that's just not possible, that Bashar cannot separate himself from Iran. And you could argue that we're seeing that validated over the past week, because he is unable to keep control of his own country. The only way that he's going to be able to fight back a serious rebel offensive is with the help of Iranian-backed militias. And so that view has, again, sort of been validated over the past week.
Thank you, Greg. We're now going to be opening the floor for a Q&A. So please, if anyone would like to ask a question, kindly raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask it. Okay, we'll start with Paul Raphael. Paul, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question for Greg. You can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Greg, you seem to intimate that Trump would not have much of any attention span with respect to the Middle East, and but based on the 4 years where he was in power, and he seemed very focused on the Middle East. He got a lot done between the Abraham Accord and maximum pressure on Iran, and the things around Israel, the new Saudi paradigm. So if we go with the assumption that he is focused on the Middle East and that he will reinstate, or we follow Randa's assumption that one of the areas will he want to do a deal is around Iran, what does that deal look like in your best guesstimate? If there's a deal with Iran and there's no hit on Iran, but more of a deal, and especially what I'm getting at is, does that deal, again, your guesstimate, no one knows, obviously, does that deal imply a disarmament of Hezbollah, or does that deal imply Lebanon is a sacrificial lamb?
And it really is a guesstimate. I think first, Iran is going to have some say in that. It's not entirely about what Trump does, but okay, to start with Trump, I think in his first term, he would have ultimately been happy to sign a deal that was exactly the same as the JCPOA, the Obama nuclear deal, but it was called the Trump Comprehensive Plan of Action. If you just called it the TCPOA instead of the JCPOA, he would have been happy to sign it, I think. I think events arguably have moved on somewhat since then, where just doing a very limited nuclear agreement that tries to roll back Iran's program to where it was before Trump abandoned the JCPOA, that is going to be a very hard sell, certainly for the Israelis, for some other people in the region, and for the more traditional Republicans in Washington. But what if that ends up being the only deal that's on offer? What if the Iranians decide they want to play hardball around the other files, around militias, around missiles, around their regional activity? What if they come to Trump and they offer a very limited nuclear deal, a JCPOA Part 2, and Trump is able to sell that as, listen, I inherited a mess from Joe Biden. He let Iran's nuclear program get to this point where it was on the threshold of being able to break out. And I stopped it. I put it back in the box, and the Iranians now, they're not going to test the nuclear bomb, on my watch in the next 4 years. Would he go for something that limited? Maybe he would. A lot of people around him are not going to be happy for it. But as Randa says, he wants to make a deal of some kind. If that is the only deal that's on offer, and he has a way that he can sell it, would he make it? I mean, it's possible. I don't know how probable it is, but I think it's possible. But again, I think a lot of this also comes down to what the Iranians are willing to do. There's a debate going on inside of Iran right now about, they're watching their whole security doctrine be blown up over the past year. And so there's a debate going on, for example, should they dash to a bomb. And that debate has been put on hold now, I think, while they wait to see what Trump is going to do when he comes into power. But the Supreme Leader could die next week. The Supreme Leader is an old man. The Supreme Leader has been a force holding Iran back from building a bomb. If he dies next week and someone more hardline on this issue comes into a position of power, do they dash for a bomb? If they do that, a nuclear deal is off the table, and then you need some kind of a big grand bargain if you're going to do anything with the Iranians. So they get a vote in this too, and it's not clear, I think, what direction either Trump or the Iranian government is going to go in.
Can I add something to what Gregg said, having to do with the timetable for Trump? Remember, he's coming into power with the trifecta. And the Iranians do not want to repeat the JCPOA experience of having an agreement that can be revoked by the next president. So they want something that is like a treaty, right? That is voted on by the US Congress and has permanence, commits the United States government irrespective of the administration. So we are talking about only the first 2 years, because my expectation, we don't know, but my expectation is that the midterm elections, we will see a change in the makeup of both Congress and the Senate. Maybe not as much in the Senate, but the right now it's 53-47. I think, given the seats that are coming up for election in the midterm, you are going to see that narrow more on the Senate side, and Congress most likely they will lose, because right now you have four seats, depending on the last election that has yet to be decided in California. So 4 or 5, I think 4 or 5 in Congress. And so for him, if he wants to have a deal, and I think he really badly needs a deal, and if the Iranians, again, as Gregg said, they will have a say, we want something that is approved by the Congress, the first 2 years are the window for him to get a deal passed with the help of a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate.
And to build, I see that Nijad has his hand up, and then I'll ask a follow-up question. Hi, Nijad, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you all. It's very informative and helpful. Can you address the possibility of an internal strife, civil war? There's been a lot of conflicting points of view that are sort of radical from both sides. Can you address that, please?
Randa, would you like to go ahead?
I don't see that happening in the short term. I mean, who's going to fight whom? There is always a scenario that if push comes to shove, Hezbollah can turn their small arms against their domestic opponents. There's always that scenario, the May 2008 scenario, if they feel they are just pushed to the wall. But even that, I don't think that's going to happen in the next year or two. I mean, I don't think we have yet to understand the extent of the decimation that has befallen Hezbollah on so many levels. And in my opinion, it's pretty dramatic. Unlike 2006, when they emerged from the war with a leadership intact, right now you are talking about a military council or military command that was the founding military command of the party, totally decimated, all of them killed. You are talking about a leader in the name of Naim Qasim, who doesn't have the gravitas, who doesn't have the respect, in my opinion, of most of the, third level commanders inside Hezbollah. He's known to be corrupt. I mean, he doesn't have the same reverence by the constituents that Nasrallah enjoyed. So they are going to be focused very much internally, organizationally, I mean, on getting their act together. Specifically, look, the biggest damage, in my opinion, to Hezbollah has been the erosion of trust within the party because of the Israeli infiltration of the party. That's a party that was formed on the basis of initially of cells that were each maybe 5 members, family connection. They knew each other very well. And so trust among them was the glue that made this party work. This trust has been eroded. I mean, they need to engage in a major examination of who are the spies, how deep the infiltration, and really root them out. And they are just at the beginning of this process, and that's going to take them some time and distract them from, or how to say, force them to prioritize this instead of engaging in any other kind of adventures. But I can see there is still, I can be the devil's advocate here and say, if push come to shove, if they feel they are going to be pushed against the wall, which I don't see that happening partly, they might turn their small arms toward domestic opponents inside Lebanon. Yes, there is still, but it's, in my opinion, a small possibility.
Gregg, would you like to add anything before we move on to other questions?
No, I agree with what Randa said on that, so I think we can move on.
Thank you. Malik, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this presentation, which was very, very interesting. But I noticed something that you didn't mention in the Middle East, neither Russia nor China. What are their, or what could be their roles in the Middle East? You mentioned Russia a little bit in Syria, but with regarding to Iran and regarding to the relation with Israel and the whole Middle East, I think they have a role to play. What is your opinion about that?
Gregg,
I think Gregg should take it. Yeah.
I think when it comes to Russia, even a couple of years ago, we had already reached a point where we'd reached the high water mark of Russia's influence in the Middle East, and it was beginning to decline. You think about 3-4 years ago when they were heavily involved in Libya, when they were backing Haftar and his push to try and overthrow the government in Tripoli and take control in Libya, when they seemed to have played this decisive role in turning the tide of the Syrian civil war and helped the Assad regime consolidate power. They were throwing around their weight in Sudan. They were doing naval exercises with the Egyptians. They seemed to be quite influential across the region. The invasion of Ukraine changed that in a lot of ways. It gave Russia less hard power that it could project in the Middle East. It couldn't deploy either the conventional army anymore because it was needed in Ukraine, or Wagner anymore because it was needed in Ukraine, and then, of course, had a falling out with the Russian state. Economically, it wasn't as important of an actor as it was. You saw Gulf states, for example, that had been investing quite heavily in Russia. Their sovereign wealth funds had been looking for opportunities to invest in Russia. After the invasion of Ukraine, after the Western sanctions were put on Russia, funds like Mubadala and the PIF in Saudi, they backed away from Russia. So economically, it became less important. Russia's influence became limited to a few small areas, to propping up Assad in Syria, to collaborating with the Saudis in OPEC Plus to try and avoid a price war that would crash oil prices. But the sort of ascendant Russia of 5 years ago, I don't think is there anymore. And I think their influence in the region is much more limited. China wants to be seen as a big player in this region, but it doesn't want to be a big player in this region in certain ways, right? Economically, it's a hugely important actor in the Middle East. It wants to pick low-hanging diplomatic fruit. This agreement last year between Iran and Saudi to restore diplomatic ties, most of that agreement was negotiated elsewhere. China pushed it over the finish line. China gave them a venue to do the final negotiations and sign that agreement, but most of the work was actually done in talks in Oman and in Iraq, and that was done with the knowledge and with the blessing of the United States. So this wasn't China swooping in to sort of do diplomacy behind the back of the US. So I think, not to say that China in the long run will not be an increasingly important diplomatic actor in the Middle East, but I think right now their role is still mostly limited to economics, and I think Russia's role in the region is declining from where it was a few years ago.
Thanks, Gregg. Maya, Amran, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. So I'm going to go back to Trump's policies in regards to the Middle East. So we saw how his win was celebrated and it was embraced and welcomed in Israel versus Biden. But given his history with the policies that he'd made, his decisions are driven by business mindset with business deals. And it's mostly influenced by the people around him and most of all his funders in the campaign. Like his last term, he had one of his biggest funders, the Adelson family, and he fulfilled his promises and he did move the embassy to Jerusalem. And he did expand the settlements in Golan Heights. So now those same funders came back in this campaign, and there's talk that his promises is going to be to declare officially Jerusalem as the capital, all of it, east and west, the capital of Israel. And how is that going to influence the region, and particularly for the Palestinians, since he also, I mean, the Abraham Accords were also a business deal, in my opinion. It was not a peace deal. How is that going to influence the region in terms of the West Bank, and the Palestinians?
Can I? Yeah, I think there are two capitals in the region that are extremely worried about the Trump administration. One is Cairo, and the second is Amman. Remember, in his first term, during one of the discussions about the Palestinians, Trump looked at his National Security Council and says, can't we move them somewhere else? We are not talking about too many people. Can't we move them somewhere else? There is a serious worry in Cairo of President Sisi getting one day a call saying, so how much will it take to move these Palestinians from Gaza to Cairo, to Egypt? There is a serious worry about them, and it's a serious possibility. The other capital that is also extremely worried is Amman, because of the possibility of annexation of the West Bank. This is talking about demands of his funders. That's now one demand of the Adelson family. I forgot the name of the woman who is now, because her husband died, she is now. That has been one of her demands for giving, I think, $100 million to his campaign. So there is a possibility of him moving forward with these two issues, and that will be a major upheaval in regional politics. At the same time, I think we have seen Saudi Arabia taking recently a very forward position, strong position on the idea of needing an irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state as a precondition for any talk of normalizing relations with Israel. And that's going to be one area which Trump will be focused on. And so Saudi Arabia will be playing, in my opinion, an important role going forward on the Palestinian file due to the leverage that it possesses on this file because of the reward that Trump and the Trump team wants. I think UAE will continue to lobby, but UAE does not have much to offer in terms of leverage to get a deal done on the Saudi. It's the Saudi who have that leverage. And so they will be playing a major role on that file, in my opinion. Correct.
And one thing that people are starting to discuss in sort of right-wing circles, both in Jerusalem and in Washington, is the Abraham Accords were sold in 2020 as preventing Israeli annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank. What wasn't in the public agreement, but what was agreed in private between Israel and the UAE and the US was that it would prevent annexation for a certain period of time. It wasn't that Israel would always take annexation off the table forever. It would do it for a period of perhaps 4 or 5 years. We're coming up on the end of those 4 or 5 years. And so there are some people wondering, can Israel repeat that trick with Saudi Arabia? You have Smotrich, you have Ben-Gvir, you have these hard right figures in the Israeli government now. Can they go to the Saudis and say, well, listen, either you normalize ties with us like the UAE did, or we're going to let Smotrich live out his dream of annexing at least Area C in the West Bank. That's going to put the Saudis, I think, in a very, very difficult position because, as Randa said, they have set the bar rhetorically very, very high. They do not want to normalize right now with Israel amid everything else that Israel is doing in Gaza and elsewhere. But if they're in a position where it's a choice between normalization and annexation, that's a very bad position for the Saudis to be in, and it's worrisome that people are talking about putting them in that position.
Thank you, Greg. I see Nadim Shhadi has his hand up. Nadim, please go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. It's again a question with a difficult to answer to both. How do you assess the internal effect within the Hezbollah constituency on the support for Hezbollah? Not just within the Shiite, but also within other parties and other communities in Lebanon after the deal. That's all.
Randa, would you like to go ahead first?
I think within the Shia community, I think it's going to depend on what happens next on two fronts. One is the reconstruction and the relief efforts. How quick can this take place? And what a role will Hezbollah be playing in pushing this forward within the Lebanese political system? And then second is how the other components of Lebanese society will behave. What is the narrative that these other components will embrace vis-a-vis Hezbollah, but also vis-a-vis the role of the Shia in the political process? Look, we have two narratives right now that both are not beneficial inside Lebanon. There is the victory narrative that Hezbollah has been pushing, which is a hollow narrative. There is no victory here. But it's not, I mean, they need to push it, but it's not beneficial at all for the next stage of Lebanese politics. But there is the other narrative, which is being pushed by the opposition, which is Hezbollah has been defeated. That's also not a good narrative because it's going to push, many of the constituents around Hezbollah who are maybe critical of what Hezbollah did and the decision it undertook on October 8th last year to go against, to the support, the war of support. So these two narratives need to be abandoned somehow. And these different components need to come into some kind of a common ground about a discussion of what's the role of Hezbollah going forward within Lebanon, and what's the role, and what to do about their weapons, And again, there has been discussion of the defensive strategy and all of this. I don't think it's immediately the right time for it, but eventually it needs to happen. But somehow, and the problem is that I don't see right now a third party who can come in and bring these groups together, right? To abandon the victory narrative, and the second abandon the defeat narrative, and just try to, create a new narrative around the common purpose of building state and building state institution. I don't see right now this third party domestically, but also I don't see this third party regionally. The US is not going to be interested in this, not Trump administration. So somebody need to play that role. But maybe I did not answer, Nadim, your question directly, but I think this is a very, it's really the second opportunity to move Lebanon away from this not political paralysis, but this whole ever-ending debate about Hezbollah and Hezbollah weapons and Lebanon's regional war. The first opportunity was in 2000 when the unilateral withdrawal of Israel There was a very important, there was, in my opinion, that was the opportunity to go toward disarming Hezbollah, toward bringing Hezbollah, into the political process. And that was missed, and we know all for the different reasons. And 2006 was not such opportunity. Today is such opportunity again. And I'm afraid it's going to be missed, because somehow people need to really, move away from those narratives, Hezbollah on one side and the opposition on the other side, and really come somehow in the middle and embrace that. And I think the Shia constituents will go for it, definitely. But their default action right now is to rally around Hezbollah, at least in the short term.
Gregg, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and I think if you don't have an alternative, then they will continue to rally. I mean, the question of reconstruction should be very important for how Hezbollah's constituents feel about the party. Yes, you can convince people during wartime that they shouldn't be critical, that they should rally around the flag, etc. If people aren't getting help with reconstruction and help with social services in the months and years to come, that will make them critical of Hezbollah. Okay, but where does that go? What does that get channeled into? Parties in Lebanon don't just have support because of the services that they provide to constituents, services that the state isn't able to provide. They also have support because they give a particular constituency a vehicle to wield political power in the Lebanese system. And so maybe people are frustrated with Hezbollah in 6 months or a year because it doesn't come through on reconstruction, but what do they channel that frustration into? What is the political alternative? If you don't have one, then that frustration doesn't translate to much, I think.
Absolutely. I'll end with a comment and the final question for both of you. I mean, you've talked a lot about, one, the reluctance of Hezbollah to disarm at the moment, two, sort of a disinterest or willingness on the part of the big players to turn a blind eye to Hezbollah's disarmament, particularly north of the Litani. You also mentioned that this might not be particular interest to the U.S. administration. So given all of these factors, how do we prevent this from being a missed opportunity for Lebanon? How do we what are the factors that will allow this to turn into an opportunity for Lebanon, knowing that also at the same time, the deliberations around the presidency today, but also the discussions around the incoming prime minister are not very encouraging, as it seems that the political class seems adamant on sort of preserving the status quo and the current balance of power and recycling some names that are not very encouraging, particularly for the prime ministership. So how do we turn this into an opportunity, and how do we prevent it from being a missed opportunity? What are the factors that are needed at this point? Randa and then Gregg.
Boy, that's something that I have been pondering, to be very honest, for some time. And I mean, every scenario I look at is, I come up with a very pessimistic outlook, as you just put it, in terms of, what's going on and what's the debate and whether it will create. I think what needs to happen is, again, there needs to be some ground for a serious dialogue between Hezbollah and the opposition. But the prerequisite for that is for the other side, the anti-Hezbollah crowd, is to get united. In 1992, when Hezbollah engaged in this year-long reflection on what Ta'if means and what does it mean for them going forward, one of the lessons and the takeaways for Hezbollah was to prevent the formation at any cost of a united Christian front. They called it the recreation of al-Maruniya siyasiyya, right? I think this time I'm not focusing only on the Maruniya siyasiyya, but I think it's the fragmentation of the opposition is going to prevent that opportunity from being used and mined in a way toward building state institutions. But at the same time, the narrative that has to come from the opposition is not a narrative of we won, you lost, you were defeated. It has to be a narrative of, you know, let's work together on moving this forward. The problem, again, I go back to the problem. Who's going to lead that discussion inside Lebanon? Who's going to push for this regionally? Internationally, I don't know, France might be interested, but I don't think they will do it. But that's going to be what's going to prevent this opportunity from being lost. And right now, I don't see that happening, to be very honest. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see that happening.
Thank you, Randa. Gregg?
Yeah, and I think there's always this expectation that outside powers are going to step in and make things better. And what inevitably ends up happening is the opposite of that. I mean, I was living in Beirut in 2020. I remember when Macron came right after the explosion, the excitement, people kissing him in the streets because everyone thought, okay, Macron is coming to fix things, to clean up the political system. 2 weeks later, everyone was cursing him because he had actually just come and extended a lifeline to the political class. And you hear a lot of that over the past few months, the way people talked about the ceasefire negotiations as if, you know, Amos Hochstein was going to be the person who would single-handedly install Joseph Aoun in the presidential palace and pave the way for political reform. You heard that after Trump was elected, people are projecting their hopes onto Donald Trump as if he is going to come into power and Lebanon is going to be at the top of his inbox and he's going to be focused on fixing the Lebanese political system. It's not going to happen that way. And it has to come from inside, and everything that Randa said about the opposition, the anti-Hezbollah forces needing to be organized, all of that, that's where it has to come from. It's not going to come from outside.
Thank you, Gregg. With this, we're going to wrap up our discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this session. Thank you, Randa. Thank you, Gregg. And have a very good evening, everyone.